The Early Church, From the Beginnings to 461 by W.H.C. Frend, 1965. Introduction. In Judea, under Tiberius, all quiet. Thus Tacitus, writing about the period of the crucifixion. Both he and his contemporary Suetonius refer to minor matters, the remission of taxes, the growth of ill-feeling between Jews and Samaritans and such like, but of the events that have made the governorship of Pontius Pilate forever memorable, not one word. This is the first problem confronting the historian of the early church. The emergence of the Christian mission took place wholly within the framework of Palestinian Judaism, and though through the Dead Sea Scrolls and the writing of Josephus we are now relatively well informed about the conditions of Palestine in this period, we still lack contemporary views of Christianity, other than those provided in the Pauline epistles and the traditions that lie behind the Gospels and Acts. The impact of Christianity on the Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds is still not easy to establish. The change, too, in historical perspectives requires a look beyond the range of Christian orthodoxies. Christianity was a cultural movement as well as a religion. Marcion, Valentius, or Paul of Samosata were heretics, but they also represented strong currents of thought in their contemporary society. From the outset, also, the Church contained within its bounds the often contradictory movements prevalent in the Jewish world of the day. It is difficult to point to any time after the Ascension when it was truly one. Differences between Palestinian Christianity and the Christianity of the Greek-speaking proselytes of the Jewish dispersion were succeeded by contrasting emphases and interpretations of the faith in the Greek and Latin halves of the Roman Empire. After the triumph of Christianity in the 4th century, cultural, social, and political influences played their part in hardening intellectual differences. It will be no longer adequate to label the African Donatists schismatics and the Egyptian Monophysites heretics without further ado. Conflicts over orthodoxy have rarely been simple conflicts over truth and error. Both now and then they have in part been the outcome of clashes of cultures, themselves represented by deep-rooted territorial or social traditions. All this, as well as the story of the great leaders of the Church and their ideas, and the development of Christian life and doctrine, is the task of the historian of the early Church to uncover. If by so doing he can further the cause of human understanding, he is thankful for that too. Part 1. Chapter 1. Rome and the Mediterranean World. Even today, the observant traveller in the Mediterranean will find much to remind him of the Greco-Roman past, whether it is the tradition of the beast combats and gladiatorial shows of the arena preserved in the bullfights of the Spanish peninsula, whether the survival of Romano-African building technique in the tiled penthouse roofs of the Kabyle homestead, whether the wooden ploughs and burnooses of the North African peasant, the terraced cultivation of the vine, the ubiquitous olive, and above all the donkey, there is a living past unchanged since the days of Augustus. The ruins of great cities like Timgad, Leptis Magna, and Baalbek speak of an urban life which once had been, but the life of the countryside has remained as it was 2,000 years ago. It is against the background of the Mediterranean world that we start this brief survey of early Christian history. How did the Church gradually conquer this world, until by the 4th mid-century it had become a great popular movement expressing the hopes of earthly prosperity and future salvation of townsman and peasant alike? What were the ideas that inspired this movement? How were they expressed in organization, liturgy, and creed? Who were its leaders, and what did they represent? Why did unity, at least in the sense of uniformity, elude the Christian congregation from the very moment that its Lord ascended into the heavens? The year is 27 BC, the date which may be taken to mark the transition from Roman Republic to Roman Empire. Roman power had reached its natural frontiers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and the Sahara Desert. What was added by the empire, namely Britain, Dacia, Arabia, and Mauritania, were buttresses to protect what had already been won. Octavian's victory over Mark Antony at Actium in 31 BC had been hailed alike in Italy, Asia Minor, and even after the death of Cleopatra in Egypt as the beginning of a new era. Order would now reign where chaos had prevailed. In the eastern provinces, the victor was proclaimed bringer of good news, Evangelion, savior, and the manifestation of Zeus. Within a few years, temples were being erected in his honor in the provincial capitals, and the calendar of Asia, Western Asia Minor, revised so as to begin the year with the birthday of the God and Savior of the whole human race. In Rome, the sequence of events was no less momentous for being clothed in constitutional forms. On the 11th of January 27 BC, Octavian had closed the doors to the Temple of Janus to mark the return of peace for the first time in 200 years. 5 days later, the Senate bestowed on its hero the title of Augustus. The text of the great inscription at the entrance of the Temple of Augustus at Ankara, which expresses the ideas of the emperor's immediate circle, reads, "In my 6th and 7th consulships, 28 to 27 BC, when I had extinguished the fires of civil war after receiving by common consent absolute control of affairs, I handed the Commonwealth over from my own control to the free disposal of the Senate and the people of Rome. For this service done by me, I received the title of Augustus by decree of the Senate, and the doorposts of my house were officially covered with laurels. A civic crown was put up over my door, and a golden shield was placed in the new Senate house, built by Julius Caesar, with an inscription recording that it was a gift to me from the Senate and people of Rome in recognition of my valor, my clemency, my justice, and my fulfillment of duty, pietas. After that time, I took precedence of others in dignity, but I enjoyed no greater power than those who were my colleagues in any magistracy." Translated Ernest Baker from Alexander to Constantine, page 229. In theory, Octavian was only the chief citizen of the Republic. In practice, he was its absolute ruler. First, the term Augustus. Contemporaries, poets such as Ovid, pointed out its connection with the sacred language of worship. 2 centuries later, the Romanized Bithynial civil servant Dio Cassius recorded how the title implied that its bearer was somewhat more than mortal. The appearance of the bay leaves of Apollo on Augustus's head on his coinage suggests that the emperor believed himself to be under Apollo's special protection. This special relationship with the world of the gods was symbolized alike for Roman citizen and subject provincial in the cult of the emperor's genius. In veiled form, it was the worship of the emperor himself, for the genius was more than guardian spirit. It had something in the nature of essence, the energizing and life-giving force of a personality, in this case the divine power assuring the permanence of the imperial house. In the provinces, the genius of Caesar was a common form of oath in commercial and personal transactions, and to refuse it could be interpreted as disloyalty. The inscription does not refer to some of the more material props to the emperor's power. These included command over some 30 legions stationed on the frontiers or in the provinces where disturbance was likely. Governors, such as Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea from AD 27 to 36, were his agents, subject to his appointment and recall. There were also the imperial freedmen, who made up the lower and middle ranks of a considerable civil service, they of Caesar's household, Phil 422. There was, finally, the emperor's personal inviolability through the perpetuation of his power as tribune. He was the center of the system, to whom all looked for security and good government, and as one of the Augustan inscriptions found at Cyrene shows, the emperor made it plain to all who inhabit the provinces how much I and the Senate take care that none of our subjects suffer wrong or extortion. the imperial providentia watched over the interests of all. The system brought immense benefits to the inhabitants of the Mediterranean world. Apart from local, though severe wars such as the Jewish War of 66 to 73, the provinces away from the frontiers enjoyed almost unbroken peace between 30 BC and AD 193, and then from 197 to the death of Alexander Severus in 235. A public orator, alias Aristides of Smyrna, could address Antonius Pius in Circa 150, "Wars have so far vanished as to be regarded as legendary events of the past. A man can travel from one country to another as though it were his native land. To be a Roman citizen, nay, even one of your subjects, is sufficient guarantee of personal safety." 30 years later, Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, no friendly critic of the existing world, wrote, "The world has peace thanks to the Romans. Even the Christians can walk without fear on the roads and travel whithersoever they please." Peace, ease of communications, and trade went together. Flavius Zexus had to face nothing worse than the storms off Cape Malea on his 72 business trips from Hierapolis to Phrygia to Rome. There were Greek-speaking trading colonies in Lyons and Vienne, and at Salona, which were eventually to play a part in bringing Christianity to their fellow provincials. There was trade in pottery, glass, and grain between Gaul, the Rhineland, and Britain. St. Paul's journeys across what even today is among the roughest country in Asia Minor, including the Taurus passes and the high plateau of Phrygia, show what was possible in the 1st century AD. Perils of robbers did not deter him from planning voyages to Spain and Illyria, and there were other missionaries almost as adventurous, such as Epaphras, who evangelized the towns on the headwaters of the Meander, and the disciples of John, who must have been Palestinians by origin settled in Ephesus. The catalogue of peoples and tongues at Pentecost shows something of the cosmopolitan character of the Jerusalem pilgrimages. Whether St. Thomas ever reached South India or not, Roman merchants did. Language and ideas followed trade. The native languages did not die out. Phrygian, Berber, and Celtic continued to be spoken, but one effect of the unification of the Mediterranean under Augustus and his successors was the emergence of two common languages, Latin to the west and Greek in the east. The language boundary, crossing the Balkans between Skopje and Sofia and the Mediterranean between Malta and Crete, was to be of tremendous significance for the evangelization of the provincials and the development of Christian doctrine and practice. Provincial administration enhanced the unifying factors within the empire. In all the provinces there were some cities which possessed full Roman franchise, the colinae, settled originally by Roman citizens such as retired veterans, and other towns, the municipia, where citizenship had been conferred on a native community. But below these, the civitates, tribal or cantonal capitals, could aspire to rise to the higher status, and members of local native aristocracies could and did acquire Roman citizenship. By the end of the 1st century, the emperor was a Spaniard, Trajan, and his best generals an Anatolian, see Julius Quadratus Bassus, and a Moor, Lucius Quietus. Add to this a uniform system of justice which, while respecting local customs, applied the principles of Roman law, an appellate system which enabled a citizen to take his case to the emperor himself, and a common currency, and one can visualize a community of life and interest such as the Mediterranean peoples have not enjoyed before or since. Moreover, the prosperity seeped down into the remotest frontier area, giving the peoples of the Roman world wealth and ease of life which was not to be theirs again before the close of the 15th century. There was, however, a price to pay. Despite prevailing security and relative prosperity, the first 2 centuries AD were not among the great progressive ages of humanity, ages in which new technical advances produce new patterns of life. One looks in vain for the development of a scientific outlook, or even for the application of what had already been discovered for productive use. There was seemingly no advance in the techniques of agriculture and seafaring. Despite considerable literary output and readership, no one thought of the printing press. Despite large and assured markets, no serious improvement in spinning and weaving techniques took place. And despite the discovery of the use of steam in Alexandria, circa 40 BC, Hero did not anticipate James Watt. Even Pliny the Elder, one of the very few men in the ancient world who lost his life through a scientific interest in natural phenomena, produced few original ideas of his own. His Natural History, in 30 books, written circa AD 75, was mainly a vast handbook of existing knowledge. With Ptolemy, circa 150, the current idea that the Earth was the center of the universe and that sun and stars revolved around it became received doctrine, with serious results for the development of religion and science in Europe for the next 1500 years. Ignorance of the physical nature of man and the universe led directly to astrological and metaphysical speculations which colored the religious thought of the time. All classes, and it would appear all parts of the Mediterranean, shared these speculations. The familiar words of St. Paul to his Galatian converts, "How turn ye back to the weak and beggarly rudiments whereunto ye desire to be in bondage again," Gal 4:9, provide an interesting example. The key word is rudiments, Greek stoicheia, meaning demonic beings or forces in the universe to whom Paul believed men and women had been enslaved before their conversion. Equally significant are the words used by Seneca to his friend Marcia in AD 60, when, in a message of comfort to her after the death of her child, he portrays the journey of the soul through the stars. "You will see," he says, "the 5 planets pursuing their different courses and sparkling down to earth from opposite directions. On even the slightest motion of these hang the fortunes of nations, and the greatest and smallest events are shaped to accord with the progress of a kindly or unkindly star." Horoscopes were avidly compiled and interpreted. The most important deity to the ordinary mortal was not Zeus, but chance, Tyche, or fate. This was the power who ended life, and from whose thraldom salvation must be sought. An unprogressive society ruled by impersonal forces whose nature was not understood might also have been morally degenerate. This was not the case. Innumerable grave memorials testify to the affection of family life, as do surviving papyrus letters to decency and sobriety. But there was also gross impurity, unrestrained by effective censorship. Some of the wall paintings and objects from Pompeii or the motifs of lamps from the legionary fortress of Indonesia on the Danube leave no doubt as to the existence of this aspect of life. "Gather ye rosebuds while ye may," or "let us eat and drink for tomorrow we die," were not merely Christian and Jewish satire, but the cheery hedonism that inspired many of the grave memorials had its darker side. There was heartlessness, too, shown in the exposure of unwanted children and gross exploitation of the underprivileged, the slaves, the conquered peoples who formed the bulk of the peasant population, and the urban poor. The life also of an intelligent woman must have been only a degree less boring and frustrating than that of the harem. It is not surprising that Christian apologists wrote of their faith, changing men's tyrannical dispositions and reforming their morals, or of women and slaves hearing the liberating message, both of Judaism and Christianity, gladly. How did the cults and philosophies of the ancient world meet the needs of its inhabitants? Let us consider religion under 2 headings, social and personal. The social aspect was designed to ensure the existing world order, and in particular the eternity and prosperity of the Roman people. The fear of chaos, if the Roman Empire fell, was shared even by the Jews and the Christians. So the Roman public religion was not a creed to which one subscribed so much as a series of cult acts performed by professionals, the priests designed to win a right relationship between gods and men. On the resultant pax deorum depended the welfare of the state and its inhabitants. The emperor, by his example of pietas and virtus, promoted the safety of his subjects, and acted as intermediary between them and the gods. Roman citizens were expected to revere and serve the Roman gods and not to practice any alien cult. Customarily, however, they might do so as long as the cult did not offend the laws and usages of Roman life, i.e., outrage to the gods through political or social crimes. Two examples, either side of the beginning of the Christian era, show the store set on conformity to the state cults. First, Polybius, the pro-Roman Greek historian of the Republic, writing circa 150 BC, but the quality in which the Roman Commonwealth is most distinctly superior over the Greeks is, in my opinion, the nature of their religious convictions. I believe that it is the very thing which among the peoples is an object of reproach, superstition, which maintains the cohesion of the Roman state. Secondly, Celsus, the pagan apologist, writing about AD 178, based his final appeal to the Christians to return to the faiths of their ancestors in order to save the empire from destruction, and as a token of loyalty to the emperor himself. Even if someone tells you to take an oath by an emperor among men, that also is nothing dreadful, for earthly things have been given to him, and whatever you receive in life, you receive from him. A generation later, in 212, the Emperor Caracalla conferred Roman citizenship on nearly all the free inhabitants of the Roman world, with the object, as the preamble of the edict stressed, that the Roman gods shall rejoice in the grateful sacrifice from the multitude of new citizens. Common worship of the gods was both the symbol and the proof of a united empire. In the provinces, any town of importance would have had its own capital modelled on that of Rome, and dedicated to the Roman gods, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. The Christian refusal even to recognize these deities as protectors of the communities in which they dwelt was a standing provocation to the authorities and the ordinary provincials alike. Roman religion was therefore more of a national cult than a personal religion. It concerned the general order of the state. Intrinsically, when analyzed, it still remained the outlook of a people in an early stage of development, the gods of light, of battle, and of agriculture, reflecting the experiences of centuries before the establishment of the empire. Not even Augustus's restoration of temples and Varro's encyclopedic work of investigation and definition of the roles of the various ancient deities could make Roman animism and pantheism a personal religion. For that, the individual had to turn to the philosophies of the day, and above all to the mystery religions. At Athens, Paul encountered Stoics and Epicureans. Of the latter, little need be said. Epicurus of Samos, 432 to 370 BC, believed that the root of all evil was fear, above all, fear of death and the beyond. The gods, he thought, had little, if any, concern in the lives of men. Death was merely long, untroubled sleep. Take away, therefore, fear of death by suggesting that there was no immortal soul to survive, and what prevented the enjoyment of happiness. This meant to Epicurus, above all, friendship and just dealing. Live quietly. Pain could be endured. Ultimately, chance ruled everything. The universe was composed of atoms whose random encounters produced life. It was a machine, neutral between right and wrong, without caprice or malevolence. To some Romans, this negative view of the universe and man's role in it was attractive. Horace and Lucretius each found the gospel of Epicurus a justification and a relief, but not many followed them. In the provinces, some educated men were Epicureans. As late as circa AD 200, one of the longest and most elaborate funerary inscriptions, that of Diogenes of Aeoneada in Asia Minor, included the creed, "There is nothing to fear in God. There is nothing to feel in death. Evil can be endured. Good can be achieved." The quintessence of the Epicurean faith. The Stoics had far greater influence. Theirs became the outlook of the educated provincial in the West in the first 2 centuries AD. They played some part in shaping both Jewish and Christian ethics, and they could number among their following the great names of Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and perhaps one might add Pelagius. Zeno of Citium in Cyprus, 4th century BC, taught that virtue consisted in living according to reason. for the reason within each human being was a part of the divine reason, the fire which underlay all life. The universe was an harmonious whole, not a collection of atoms. Either an ordered universe, mused Marcus Aurelius, or a welter of confusion. Assuredly, then, a world order. Recall to your mind the alternatives, a foreseeing providence or blind atoms, and all the abounding proofs that the world is one city. Man could be at home in the universe, for whether he were emperor, soldier, or slave, he partook of the same creative power that guided it. He was a tiny fragment of the seminal word or universal reason. To Marcus Aurelius, all situations were alike. All were aspects of the divine harmony into which the individual must fit himself. Whatever expedient to thee, O world, is expedient to me. Alexander and his groom were alike, both passed and perished. Asia and Europe are but corners of creation. The ocean is but a drop, and Athos but a grain in respect of the universe, the whole present but a point in eternity. All is petty, mutable, and transient. With a sense of grandeur went a sense of resignation. Events moved forward on a predetermined course which no human agency could alter. It gave no hope of immortality beyond the memory of one's virtuous deeds. It was a creed of earthly duty, but not an answer for the religious mind. The criticism made by Justin Martyr, circa AD 130, was apt. I put myself, he wrote, in the hands of a Stoic, and I stayed with him for a long time. But when I got no further in the matter of God, for he did not know himself, and he used to say that such knowledge was not necessary, I left him. Justin went on to Platonism before turning finally to Christianity. And in the East, Platonism, or its popular derivatives, provided the intellectual alternative to fatalism. Plato, 429 to 347 BC, had believed that knowledge of the universe was possible, but not through means so variable and unreliable as the human senses. Beyond the visible world existed a transcendent world of forms and ideas which could be apprehended by the mind alone. In other words, the human mind was capable of forming a synthesis from the confused mass of impressions which rained in on it through the senses. But Plato went on to assert that justice, beauty, truth, goodness, etc., were not results of thoughts and actions, but had an objective existence in themselves, to which the human soul must ultimately conform. Crowning the whole system was the ideal good, on which converged all other aspects of reality, like the apex of a pyramid. The transition to a theology of God and a creation, moved and guided by his providence, was easy, and Plato provided also a system for the individual to apply to himself. Man's task was conformity, so far as possible, with ideal justice and goodness. Through apprehension of the real forms pre-existing and continuing to eternity, a man could distinguish the demands of a debased and transitory life on earth from a real existence beyond which his soul would ultimately enjoy. On earth, he must master the irrational element within himself by ascetic practices and thought. He must purify his being and prepare for the soul's liberation. The body was a prison, the mere envelope for the soul. This alone would transcend to reality. These views, ultimately optimistic in their view of human nature, gave hope to many of the provincials of the Greek-speaking world. They provided an antidote to Iranian demonology by their assertion of monotheism and call to philosophic asceticism. They were to have a profound effect on the theology of the Christians in Alexandria. The philosophies, even in their popular form, were for the few. More people, including many women, looked to the mystery cults for comfort and salvation. Of these, Isis worship, Orphism, Mithraism, the Bacchics, and Pythagoreans were among the most important. The hold which they exercised on their worshippers may be illustrated by a description of Juvenal, circa AD 120, of a pious adherent of the cult of Isis. 3 times in the depth of winter the devotee of Isis will dive into the chilly waters of the Tiber, and, shivering with cold, will drag herself around the temple with bleeding knees. If the goddess commands, she will go to the bounds of Egypt and take water from the Nile, and empty it within the sanctuary. Satires 6, 523. It was no exaggeration. The story of Lucius in Apuleius's The Golden Ass is a tale also of sacrifice and obedience to the goddess, who was known as Queen of Heaven. The mystery cults were all refinements of age-old legends of growth and rebirth shown in the seasons, to which influences from Babylonian religion and Hinduism had been added. In the majority, a mother goddess was worshipped, with a male deity who was either her consort or her son. He represented the power of vegetation dying in the autumn to be reborn in the following spring. So too, humanity, the victim of the powers of chaos and negation, would rise triumphant through knowledge of and identification with the god. By initiation into these systems, the individual gained that identification. He was no longer a stranger and afraid in a world I never made, but a participant in immortality. I conquer fate, and fate obeys me, read Plutarch's praises of Isis and Osiris. Lucius describes how, on his initiation into the rites of Isis, he trod Proserpina's threshold. I passed through all the elements and returned. It was midnight, but I saw the sun radiant with bright light. I came into the very presence of the gods below and the gods above, and I adored them face to face. He was saved. He could fathom the secrets of the universe. He was no longer afraid. These cults spread all over the Mediterranean world, brought by soldiers and travelers, and above all, accompanying the great waves of Eastern immigrants that invaded the city of Rome from the mid-century BC onward. These immigrants confronted the Roman authorities with the major problem of working out a tolerable relationship between the official religion and the cults. Roman religion, though nationalistic, was not inhospitable to other religions, and moreover recognized the right of subject and allied peoples to their own worship. Throughout Roman Republican history, there had been a tendency to expand the pantheon. Juno and Mars had originally been the gods of Italic tribes, and Cybele was introduced during the final crisis of the Punic War in 204. The problem was, at what stage did foreign worship become evil worship, pravia religio, abominable to the Roman gods? For instance, in the Celtic provinces of northwestern Europe, it was possible to find Roman equivalents for the Celtic gods Teutates and Tanarus. But what about rites involving human sacrifice practiced by their priests, the Druids? In Rome, the cult of Dionysus could itself be beneficial to the community, but when the worship degenerated into conspiratorial orgy, it must be repressed. One finds the authorities working pragmatically, from case to case. If the foreign deities appeared to threaten the prestige of the Roman gods, they would be suppressed. If their rites gave rise to scandal, their adherents would be punished. If Roman citizens participated in foreign religion to the point which offended either of these canons, they could also expect sanctions. This policy was illustrated by the case of the Bacchanals. Though the affair arose in 186 BC, it was described in detail by Livy in the reign of Augustus. The worship had been introduced into Rome from the Greek cities of South Italy, and had become immensely popular. Then scandals began. There were rumors of people being poisoned and done to death in the rites, and of a conspiracy to fire the city. The Senate acted, and Livy put these words into the mouth of the consul Stomius: "For there is nothing more deceptive in appearance than false religion. Where the power of the gods is put forward as a pretext for crimes, fear takes hold of the mind, lest in punishing human deceits we may be violating something of the divine law which had been mingled with them. For men who were wisest in divine and human law judged that nothing was more dissolvent to religion than where sacrifice was made to foreign rather than native deities." The passage sums up the difficulties the authorities faced. However much they might suspect the mystery cults as insulting to the gods of Rome, and a cloak perhaps for black magic and conspiracy against the state, they were reluctant to go to extremes. Individuals would be punished with the utmost harshness, as were the Bacchanals, and practices put under strict supervision. But the worship itself was not prescribed. The worshippers of Isis and purveyors of horoscopes and unlicensed auguries would be similarly dealt with, experiencing in the century either side of the Christian era a bewildering succession of persecution, unofficial tolerance, and official favor. Despite all the bans and temporary prescriptions, Isis, the Bacchae, and the rest re-established themselves in Rome. The Christians in the time of Nero were another foreign cult. Their association with Judaism, however, was a vital factor in shaping Roman policy towards them, for the Jews in the 1st century AD were among the most difficult of the legacies which Rome inherited from her conquest of the Hellenistic world.